Transforming urban life and Western society. Western society itself was reshaping the world. At the peak of its power and pride, the West entered the third in most dynamic phase of the aggressive expansion that had begun with the Crusades and continued with May great discoveries and the rise of seaborne colonial empires. An ever growing stream of products, people, and ideas flowed out of Europe in the 19th century. Hardly any corner of the globe was left untouched. The most spectacular manifestations of Western expansion came in the late 19th century when the leading European nations established or enlarged their far-flung political empires. The political annexa, tie-in of territory in the 1880s, the new imperialism, as it is often called by historians, was the capstone of a profound underlying economic and technological process. How and why did this many-sided, epoch-making expansion occur in the 19th century? What were some of its consequences for the West? How did Western expansion affect the rest of the world? These are the questions this chapter will examine. The opening of China and Japan ropes relatively peaceful development of robust Hoots-ian sparsely populated North America, Australia, and much of Latin America absorbed huge quantities of stores, investments, and migrants. From a Western point of view, that was the most important aspect of OPE's global thrust. Yet Europe's economic and penetration of old, densely populated civilizations also profoundly significant, especially for the non-Topian peoples affected by it. With such civilizations, Sopians also increased their trade and profit. More, whereas had been the case ever since Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus, the expanding Western society prepared to use force, if necessary, to attain its desires. This was what happened in China and Japan, two crucial examples of the general pattern of intrusion into non-Western lands. Traditional Chinese civilization was self-sufficient. For centuries, China had sent more goods and inventions to Europe than it had received, and this was still the case in the 18th century. Europeans, and the English in particular, had developed a taste for Chinese tea, but they had to pay for it with hard silver since China was supremely uninterested in European wares. Trade with Europe was carefully regulated by the Chinese imperial government, the Manchu dynasty, which was more interested in isolating and controlling the strange sea barbarians than in pursuing commercial exchange. The imperial government refused to establish diplomatic relations with the inferior European states, and it required all foreign merchants to live in the southern city of Canton and to buy from and sell to only the local merchant monopoly. Practices considered harmful to Chinese interests, such as the sale of opium and the export of silver from China, were strictly forbidden. For years, the little community of foreign merchants in Canton had to accept the Chinese system. By the 1820s, however, the dominant group, the British, were flexing their muscles. Moreover, in the smoking of opium, that destructive and ensnaring vice denounced by Chinese decrees, they had found something the Chinese really wanted. Grown legally in British-occupied India, opium was smuggled into China by means of fast ships and bribed officials. The more this rich trade developed, the greedier British merchants became, and the more they resented the patriotic attempts of the Chinese government to stem the tide of drug addiction. By 1836, the aggressive goal of the British merchants in Canton was an independent British colony in China and safe and unrestricted liberty in trade. Spurred on by economic motives, they pressured the British government to take decisive action and enlisted the support of British manufacturers with visions of vast Chinese markets to be opened. At the same time, the Manchu government decided that the opium trade had to be stamped out. It was ruining the people and stripping the empire of its silver, which was going to British merchants to pay for the opium. The government began to prosecute Chinese drug dealers vigorously, and in 1839 sent special envoy Lin Se-su to Canton. Lin Se-su ordered the foreign merchants to obey China's laws. For our great Linified Manchu Empire regards itself as responsible for the habits and morals of its subjects and cannot rest content to see any of them become victims of a deadly poison. The British merchants refused and were expelled, whereupon war soon broke out. Using troops from India and being in control of the seas, the British occupied several coastal cities and forced China to surrender. In the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, the imperial government was forced to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain forever, pay an indemnity of $100 million, and open up 4 large cities to foreign trade with low tariffs. Nanking. Thereafter, the opium trade flourished, and Hong Kong developed rapidly as an Anglo-Chinese enclave. China continued to nurture illusions of superiority and isolation, however, and refused to accept foreign diplomats in Peking, the imperial capital. Finally, there was a second round of foreign attack between 1856 1860, culminating in the occupation of Peking Tai. 18,000 British and French troops and Baines, tensional burning of the Emperor's summer paddock. Another round of harsh treaties gave Europulf Mechance and missionaries greater privileges and Coates Tyon. Thus did Europeans use military aggress on to blow a hole in the wall of Chinese seclusion and open the country to foreign trade and foreign ideas. Blasting away at Chinese sovereignty as well, they forced the Chinese to accept trade and investment terms for the foreseeable future. And on unfavorable China's neighbor, Japan had its own highly distinctive civilization and even less use for Westerners. European traders and missionaries first arrived in Japan in the 16th century. By 1640, Japan had reacted quite now, tithely to their presence. The government decided to scale off the country from all European influences of dare to preserve traditional Japanese culture and society. Officials ruthlessly persecuted Japanese Christians and expelled all but a few Dutch merchants, who were virtually imprisoned in a single port and rigidly controlled. When American and British whaling ships began to pair off Japanese coasts almost 200 years later, the policy of exclusion was still in effect. An order of 1825 commanded Japanese officials to drive away for Sign vessels without second thought. Japan's unbending isolation seemed hostile and barbaric to the West, particularly to the United States. It complicated the practical problems of shipwrecked American sailors and the provisioning of whaling ships and China traders sailing in the Castern Pacific. It also thwarted the hope of trade and profit. Moreover, Americans shared the self-confidence and dynamism of expanding Western society. They had taken California from Mexico in 1848, and Americans felt destined to play a great role in the Pacific. It seemed, therefore, the duty of the United States to force the Japanese to share their ports and behave as a civilized nation. After several unsuccessful American attempts to establish commercial relations with Japan, Commodores Matthew Perry steamed into Edo, now Tokyo Bay, in 1853 and demanded diplomatic negotiations with the emperor. Japan entered a grave crisis. Some Japanese warriors urged resistance, but senior officials realized how defenseless their cities were against naval bombardment. Shocked and humiliated, they reluctantly signed a treaty with the United States that opened 2 ports and permitted trade. Over the next 5 years, more treaties spelled out the rights and privileges of the Western nations and their merchants in Japan. Japan was opened. What the British had done in China with war, the Americans had done in Japan with only the threat of war. Western penetration of Egypt. Egypt's experience illustrates not only the explosive power of the expanding European economy and society, but also their seductive appeal in non-Western lands. European involvement in Egypt also led to a new model of formal political control, which European powers outpided widely in Africa and Asia after 1882. Of great importance in African and Middle Eastern history, the ancient land of the pharaohs had since 525 BC been ruled by a succession of foreigners, most Coptly by the Ottoman Turks. In 1798, French army's Surtur young general Napoleon Bonaparte invaded the Egyptian part of the Ottoman Empire and occupied the territory for 3 years. Into the power vacuum let by the French withdrawal stepped an extraordinaire, daring Albanian-born Turkish general, Muhammad Ali, 1760 to 1849. First appointed governor of Egypt by the Turkish Sultan, Muhammad Ali soon disposed of his political rivals and set out to build his own state on the strength of a large, powerful army organized along European lines. He drafted for the first time the illiterate, despised peasant masses of Egypt, and he hired French and Italian army officers to train these raw recruits and their Turkish officers. The government was also reformed. New lands were cultivated, and communications were improved. By the time of his death in 1849, Muhammad Ali had established a strong and virtually independent de-Egyptian state to be ruled by his family on a hereditary basis within the Turkish Empire. Muhammad Ali's policies of modernization attracted large numbers of Europeans to the banks of the Nile. As one Arab sheikh of the Ottoman Empire remarked in the 1830s, Englishmen are like ants. If one finds a bit of meat, hundreds follow. The port city of Alexandria had more than 50,000 Europeans by 1864, most of them Italian, Greek, French, or English. Europeans served not only as army officers, but also as engineers, doctors, government officials, and police officers. Others found their meat in trade, finance, and shipping, to pay for a modern army as well as for European handlers. To pay for a modern army as well as for European services and manufactured goods, Muhammad all encouraged the development of commercial agriculture geared to the European market. This development had profound implications. Egyptian peasants had been poor but largely self-sufficient, growing food for their own consumption on state-owned lands allotted to them by tradition. Faced with the possibility of export agriculture, high-ranking officials and members of Muhammad Ali's family began carving large private landholdings out of the state domain. The new landlords made the peasants their tenants and forced them to grow cash crops for European markets. Bowtrowing money from European lenders at high rates and sale, making good profits, Egyptian landowners modernized agriculture, but to the detriment of peasant well-being. These trends continued under Muhammad Ali's grandson Ismail, who in 1863 began his 16-year rule as Egypt's Khedive, or prince. Educated at France's leading military academy, Ismail was a westernizing a autocrat. He dreamed of using European technology and capital to modernize Egypt quickly and build a vast empire in Northeast Africa. The large irrigation networks he promoted caused cotton production and exports to Europe to boom. Ismail also borrowed large sums to install modern communications, and with his support, the Suez Canal was completed by a French company in 1869. The Arabic of the masses, rather than the Turkish of the conquerors, became the official language, and young Egyptians educated in Europe helped spread new skills and new ideas in the bureaucracy. Cairo acquired modern boulevards, Western hotels, and an opera zonger in Africa. I've now formed part of Europe, house. As Ismail proudly declared, "My country is no word." Yet Ismail was too impatient and too reckless. His projects were enormously expensive, and the sale of his stock in the Suez Canal to the British government did not relieve the situation. By 1876, Egypt owed foreign bondholders a colossal $450 million and could not pay the interest on its debt. Rather than let Egypt go bankrupt and repudiate its loans, as had some Latin American countries and U.S. state governments in the Carly 19th century, the governments of France and Great Britain intervened politically to protect the European bankers who held the Egyptian bonds. They forced Ismail to appoint French and British commissioners to oversee Egyptian finances so that the Egyptian debt would be paid in full. This was a momentous decision. It implied direct European political control and was a sharp break with the previous pattern of trade and investment throughout most of the 19th century. Europeans had used naked military might and political force, primarily to make sure that non-Western lands would accept European trade and investment. Now Europeans were going to determine the state budget and effectively rule Egypt. Foreign financial control evoked a violent nationalist tick reaction among Egyptian religious leaders, young intellectuals, and army officers. In 1879, under the leadership of Colonel Ahmed Arabi, they formed the Egyptian Nationalist Party. Continuing diplomatic pressure, which forced Ismail to abdicate in favor of his weak son, Tewfik, R. 1879 to 1892, resulted in bloody anti-European riots in Alexandria in 1882. A number of Europeans were killed, and Tewfik and his court had to flee to British ships for safety. When the British fleet bombarded Alexandria, more riots swept the country, and Colonel Arabi declared that an irreconcilable war gisted between the Egyptians and the English. But a British expeditionary force decimated Arabi's forces and, as a result, occupied all of Egypt. Other British said their occupation was temporary, but Flemish armies remained in Egypt until 1956. They maintained the facade of the Khedive's government as the Great Migration, 865, an autonomous province of the Ottoman Empire, but the Khedive was a mere puppet. The able British consul, General Evelyn Baring, later Lord Cromer, ruled the country after 1883. Once a vocal opponent of involvement in Egypt, Baring was a paternalistic reformer who had come to believe that without European interference, an initiative reform is impossible here. Baring's rule did result in tax reforms and better conditions for peasants, while foreign bondholders tranquilly collected the interest on their investments, and Egyptian nationalists nursed their injured pride. In Egypt, Baring and the British reluctantly but spectacularly provided a new model for European expansion in densely populated lands. Such expansion was based on military force, political domination, and a self-justifying ideology of beneficial reform. This model was to predominate until 1914. Thus did Europe's Industrial Revolution, ECAD-TU tremendous political as well, A's economic expansion throughout the world. The expansion of Western society reached its apex between about 1880 and 1914. In those years, the leading European nations not only continued to send massive streams of migrants, money, and manufactured goods around the world, but also rushed to create or enlarge vast political empires abroad. This political empire building contrasted sharply with the economic penetration of non-Western territories between 1816 and 1880, which had left a China or a Japan opened, but politically independent. By contrast, the empires of the late Western imperialism, 871 19th century, recalled the old European colonial empires of the 17th and 18th centuries, and led contemporaries to speak of the new imperialism. Characterized by a frantic rush to plant the flag over as many people and as much territory as possible, the new imperialism had momentous consequences. It resulted in new tensions among competing European states, and it led to wars and rumors of war with non-European powers. The new imperialism was aimed primarily at Africa and Asia. It put millions of black, brown, and yellow peoples directly under the rule of whites. How and why did whites come to rule these peoples? The scramble for Africa. The most spectacular manifestation of the new imperialism was the seizure of Africa, which broke sharply with previous patterns and fascinated contemporary Europeans and Americans. As late as 1880, European nations controlled only 10% of the African continent, and their possessions were hardly increasing. The French had begun conquering Algeria in 1830, and within 50 years, substantial numbers of French, Italian, and Spanish colonists had settled among the overwhelming Arab majority. At the other end of the continent, in South Africa, the British had taken possession of the Dutch settlements at Cape Town during the wars with Napoleon I. This takeover had led disgruntled Dutch cattle ranchers and farmers in 1835 to make their so-called Great Trek into the interior, where they fought the Zulu and Xhosa peoples for land. After 1853, while British colonies such as Canada and Australia were beginning to evolve towards self-government, the Boers, or Afrikaners, as the descendants of the Dutch in the Cape Colony were beginning to call themselves, proclaimed their political independence and defended against British armies. By 1880, Afrikaner and British settlers, who detested each other, had wrested control of much of South Africa from the Zulu, Xhosa, and other African peoples. European trading posts and forts dating back to the Age of Discovery and the slave trade dotted the coast of West Africa. The Portuguese proudly but ineffectively held their old possessions in Angola and Mozambique. Elsewhere over the great mass of the continent, Europeans did not rule. Between 1880 and 1900, the situation changed drastically. Britain, France, Germany, and Italy scrambled for African possessions as if their national livelihoods depended on it. By 1900, nearly the whole continent, Western imperialism 873, had been carved up and placed under European rule. Only Ethiopia in northeast Africa, which repulsed Italian invaders, and Liberia on the West African coast remained independent. In the years before 1914, the European powers tightened their control and established colonial governments to rule their gigantic empires. Map 26.2. The Dutch settler republics also succumbed to imperialism, but the final outcome was quite different. The British, led by Cecil Rhodes in the Cape Colony, leapfrogged over the Afrikaner states I in the early 1890s and established protectorates over Bechuanaland, now Botswana, and Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe and Zambia, named I in honor of its freelance imperial founder. Trying unsuccessfully to undermine the stubborn Afrikaners in the Transvaal, where English-speaking capitalists like Rhodes were developing fabulously rich gold mines, the British conquered their white rivals in the Bloody Boer War, 1899 to 1902. In 1910, their territories were united with the old Cape Colony and the eastern province of Natal in a new Union of South Africa, established unlike any other territory in Africa, as a largely self-governing colony. This enabled the defeated Afrikaners to use their numerical superiority over the British settlers to gradually take political power, as even the most educated non-whites lost the right to vote outside the Cape Colony. See the feature Individuals in Society, Cecil Rhodes, Empire Building I in Southern Africa. In the complexity of the European seizure of Africa, certain events and individuals stand out. Of enormous importance was the British occupation of Egypt, which established the new model of formal political control. There was also the role of Leopold II of Belgium, R. 1865 to 1909, an energetic, strong-willed monarch with a lust for distant territory. "The sea bathes our coast, the world lies before us," he had exclaimed in 1861. "Steam and electricity have annihilated distance, and all the non-appropriated lands on the surface of the globe can become the field of our operations and of our success." By 1876, Leopold was focusing on Central Africa. Subsequently, he formed a financial syndicate under his personal control to send Henry M. Stanley, a sensation-seeking journalist and part-time explorer, to the Congo Basin. Stanley was able to establish trading stations, sign Mail 26.2, the Partition of Africa. European nations carved up Africa after 1880 and built vast political empires. What African states remained independent? Treaties with African chiefs and plant Leopold's flag. Leopold's actions alarmed the French, who quickly sent out an expedition under Pierre de Brazza. In 1880, de Brazza signed a treaty of protection with the chief of the large Teke tribe and began to establish a French protectorate on the north bank of the Congo River. Leopold's buccaneering intrusion into the Congo area raised the question of the political fate of Africa. By 1882, when the British successfully invaded and occupied Egypt, the richest and most developed land in Africa, Europe had caught African fever. There was a gold rush mentality, and the race for territory was on. To lay down some basic rules for this new and dangerous game of imperialist competition in sub-Saharan Africa, Jules Ferry of France and Otto von Bismarck of Germany arranged an international conference on Africa in Berlin in 1884 and 1885. The conference established the principle that European claims to African territory had to rest on effective occupation in order to be recognized by other states. This principle was very important. It meant that Europeans would push relentlessly into interior regions from all sides, and that no single European power would be able to claim the entire continent. The conference recognized Leopold's personal rule over a neutral Congo Free State and declared all of the Congo Basin a free trade zone. The conference also agreed to work to stop slavery and the slave trade in Africa. The Berlin Conference coincided with Germany's sudden emergence as an imperial power. Prior to about 1880, Bismarck, like many other European leaders at the time, had seen little value in colonies. Colonies reminded him, he said, of a poor but proud nobleman who wore a fur coat when he could not afford a shirt underneath. Then, in 1884 and 1885, as political agitation for expansion increased, Bismarck did an abrupt about-face, and Germany established protectorates over a number of small African kingdoms and tribes, in Togo, Cameroons, Southwest Africa, and later East Africa. In acquiring colonies, Bismarck cooperated against the British with Francis Ferry, who was as ardent for empire as H.E. was for education. With Bismarck's tacit approval, the French pressed vigorously southward from Algeria, eastward from their old forts on the Senegal coast, and northward from de Brazza's newly formed protectorate on the Congo River. The object of these three thrusts was Lake Chad, a malaria-infested swamp on the edge of the Sahara Desert. Meanwhile, the British began enlarging their West African enclaves and impatiently pushing northward from the Cape Colony and westward from Zanzibar. Cecil Rhodes, 1853 to 1902, epitomized the dynamism and the ruthlessness of the new imperialism. He built a corporate monopoly, claimed vast tracts in Africa, and established the famous Rhodes Scholarships to develop colonial and American leaders who would love and strengthen the British Empire. But to Africans, he left a bitter legacy. Rhodes came from a large middle-class family, and a T-17 went to southern Africa to seek his fortune. He soon turned to diamonds, newly discovered at Kimberley, picked good partners, and was wealthy by 1876. But Rhodes, often called a dreamer, wanted more. He entered Oxford University while returning periodically to Africa, and his musings crystallized in a belief in progress through racial competition and territorial expansion. "I contend," he wrote, "that we English are the finest race in the world, and the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race." Rhodes's belief in British expansion never wavered. In 1880, he formed the De Beers Mining Company, and by 1888 his firm monopolized southern Africa's diamond production and garnered fabulous profits. Rhodes also entered the Cape Colony's legislature and became the all-powerful prime minister from 1890 to 1896. His main objective was to dominate the Afrikaner republics and to impose British rule on as much land as possible beyond their northern borders. Working through a state-approved private company financed in part by De Beers, Rhodes's agents forced and cajoled African kings to British protection, then put down rebellions with Maxim machine guns. Britain thus obtained a great swath of empire on the cheap. But Rhodes, like many high achievers obsessed with power and personal aggrandizement, went too far. He backed, and then in 1896 failed to call back, a failed invasion of the Transvaal, which was designed to topple the Dutch-speaking republic. Repudiated by top British leaders who had encouraged his plan, Rhodes had to resign as prime minister. In declining health, he continued to agitate against the Afrikaner republics. He died at age 49 as the Boer War, 1899 to 1902, ended. In accounting for Rhodes's flawed achieve, Cecil Rhodes, after crushing the last African revolt in 1896, Brown Brothers, sympathetic and critical biographers stress his imposing size, enormous energy, and powerful personality. His ideas were commonplace, but he believed in them passionately, and he could persuade and inspire others to follow his lead. Rhodes the idealist was nonetheless a born negotiator, a crafty dealmaker who believed that everyone could be had for a price. According to his best biographer, Rhodes's homosexuality, discreet, partially repressed, and undeniable, was also a major component of his magnetism and his success. Never comfortable with women, he loved male companionship. He drew together a band of brothers, both gay and straight, to share in the pursuit of power. Rhodes cared nothing for the rights of blacks. Ever a combination of visionary and opportunist, he looked forward to an ever-ritual reconciliation of Afrikaners and British in a united white front. Therefore, as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, he broke with the colony's liberal tradition and supported Afrikaner demands to reduce drastically the number of black voters and limit black freedoms. This helped lay the foundation for the Union of South Africa's brutal policy of racial segregation, known as apartheid, after 1948. Their thrust southward from Egypt was blocked in the Sudan by fiercely independent Muslims, who massacred a British force at Khartoum in 1885. A decade later, another British force under General Horatio H. Kitchener moved cautiously and more successfully up the Nile River, building a railroad to supply arms and reinforcements as it went. Finally, in 1898, these British troops met their FOC at Omdurman, see map 26.2, where Muslim tribesmen armed with spears charged time and time again, only to be cut down by the recently invented machine gun. For one smug participant, the young British officer Winston Churchill, it was like a pantomime scene in a play. These extraordinary foreign figures march up one by one from the darkness of barbarism to the footlights of civilization, and their conquerors, taking their possessions, forget even their names, nor will history record such trash. For another, more somber English observer, it was not a battle, but an execution. The bodies were not in heaps, but they spread evenly over acres and acres. In the end, 11,000 brave but poorly armed Muslim tribesmen lay dead, while only 20 Scythe Britons had been killed. Continuing up the Nile after the Battle of Omdurman, Kitchener's armies found that a small French force had already occupied the village of Fashoda. Locked in imperial competition with Britain ever since the British occupation of Egypt, France had tried to beat the British to one of Africa's last unclaimed areas, the upper reaches of the Nile. The result was a serious diplomatic crisis and even the threat of war. Eventually, racked by the Dreyfus Affair, see page 845, and unwilling to fight, France backed down and withdrew its forces, allowing the British to take over. The British conquest of the Sudan exemplifies the general process of empire building in Africa. The fate of the Muslim force at Omdurman was eventually inflicted on all native peoples who resisted European rule. They were blown away by vastly superior military force. But however much the European powers squabbled for territory and privilege around the world, they always had the sense to stop short of actually fighting each other. Imperial ambitions were not worth a great European war. Imperialism in Asia. Although the sudden division of Africa was more spectacular, Europeans also extended their political control in Asia. In 1815, the Dutch ruled little more than the island of Lava in the East Indies. Hereafter, they gradually brought almost all of the 3,000-mile archipelago under their political authority, though, in good imperialist fashion, they had to share some of the spoils with Britain and Germany. In the critical decade of the 1880s, the French under the leadership of Ferry took Indochina. India, Japan, and China also experienced a profound imperialist impact, map 26.3. Two other great imperialist powers, Russia and the United States, also acquired rich territories in Asia. Russia, whose history since the later Middle Ages had been marked by almost continual expansion, moved steadily forward on two fronts throughout the 19th century. Russians conquered Muslim areas to the south in the Caucasus and in Central Asia, and also proceeded to nibble greedily on China's outlying provinces in the Far East, especially in the 1890s. The United States' great conquest was the Philippines, taken from Spain in 1898 after the Spanish-American War. When it quickly became clear that the United States had no intention of granting independence, Philippine patriots rose in revolt and were suppressed only after long, bitter fighting. Not until 1934 was a timetable for independence established. Some Americans protested the taking of the Philippines, but to no avail. Thus, another great Western power joined the imperialist ranks in Asia.